Hi, welcome to the 2023 issue of The Scholar. We're here with Chara today, who is a second-year PhD student in theoretical and applied linguistics, and we're going to be talking about the language crisis. Chara's work is with students who have English as an additional language, and in particular, she looks at prosody, which characterizes the music of language.
That's right, I'll talk more about this later.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that. So my first question really is why students with English as an additional language?
There is a multitude of reasons, and I will just start with the numbers first, just so that you can understand what we're talking about here. So back in 2015, we knew that on average 13.6% of pupils spoke English as an additional language. And just to clarify, that basically means that they have another home language at home. So essentially, these are bilingual children. Sometimes they can also be trilingual or multilingual, but this is an umbrella term for all of those children who are learning English as a second language, but they do have another language at home. So we knew that number, that percentage was 13.6 on average 2015, but this has risen since then. The last time the Bell Foundation reported on this, they said that there is 1.6 million approximately EAL pupils in England. We know that over 40% of pupils in classrooms in London speak English as an additional language. We also know that over half of the world's population is bilingual. There are countries that are bilingual. We know that essentially most people right now on Earth just don't speak only one language. Maybe I shouldn't say most, but I should say a vast amount of people, a vast number of people do so. So we're also interested in bilingualism as a whole. But you might ask why EAL in particular in the UK? And it's not just the numbers. So we know from some inconclusive mixed findings that the learning outcomes of EAL pupils are not the same as their monolingual peers. And I'm saying inconclusive findings because they are sort of contradictory, not only within the UK, but also comparing EAL pupils to other bilingual pupils in other parts of the world. So for instance, we know that in the UK, we have some data showing that the reading outcomes, not on word reading specifically, but in reading comprehension as a whole in EAL pupils, is just not the same as the monolingual pupils in the classrooms. However, that is not the case in other parts of the world, such as Canada, for instance. We don't know exactly why this is happening, and it's been hypothesized in very recent studies that it could be a difference in socioeconomic status. This is part of the reason why I'm taking this into account in my own research. And there is a bigger question of inclusive education. Is our language education, is our education as a whole available and inclusive for everyone, for all children, if we're not taking into account all of the immigrant, refugee children, all children of refugees and immigrants in the UK? Is it really inclusive if we're not actively trying to include them in our policies, if we're not taking their skills into account? So broadly, these are the reasons why I'm working on pupils who speak English as an additional language. It's not just the hard numbers, it's what this actually means in the classroom and beyond.
Can you describe for us what you mean by language crisis then?
First of all, quick note, it's not me who said it. So back in 2019, there was this article posted on the British Council website by Professor Michael Kelly, and he's a language advocate and expert, and he advises the all-party parliamentary group. And essentially, he had a report saying that the language crisis, which I'll explain what it is in a minute, is costing the UK back in 2019, so pre-pandemic, 3.5% of the GDP. So by language crisis, essentially, he and I at the moment, we're both describing a language deficit, a lack of skill in foreign languages that are not English. And this language crisis essentially means that businesses rely overly on the Anglophone market, can't do business outside of it. When they do, that increases the chance of miscommunication, trouble with business inquiries, bad customer support and service. It's a very tangible issue of getting people to communicate with one another for profit in this case. So he's describing the language crisis in the context of economic success, commercial development. In my view, it goes beyond that. It's about building a skill set. Learning languages is not just opportunistic. It's not just about doing business. It's about improving your cultural awareness. It's about being able to travel the world and communicate with people. We know that learning languages has so many benefits on all sides of us, on the emotional side, on the cognitive side. We know that it can help us connect with people beyond borders, beyond any sort of limitation that we might have when the only thing we share is us speaking one language. So he describes the language crisis in the context of the Anglophone market and the reliance on it. I'm describing the language crisis both in that sense. I acknowledge that this is an issue, a very tangible one that we are seeing with the cost of living crisis and everything. However, keep in mind, this was written before the pandemic. I think we saw the actual language crisis when it comes to language teaching and language learning during the pandemic, when people were deprived of peer communication, and we know that pupils learn by speaking to one another. We know that our pupils were basically deprived from that. In-person communication, interaction essentially ceased, and all educators in the UK and beyond know that this had a very important and negative impact on language skills. So I view the language crisis in a more multidimensional way that takes into account developments after 2019, essentially the pandemic, but also in terms of this language deficit which means that we're not raising people able to communicate with the world.
Yeah. What do you think then has triggered this language crisis?
So first of all, I mentioned just a minute ago the Anglophone market, and it's interesting to go back to this and really try to explain why is it an Anglophone market in the first place. The short answer would be post-colonialism. It all very much has to do with the status of the English language as a lingua franca, as a global language. Right now, me and you, we don't share a common first language, but we are using English as our common language of communication. And so does the entire Anglophone market then. And this very much has to do with the rise of the British Empire, with colonialization, our new term that is not just colonialism, and this post-colonial era where there's world Englishes, there's global Englishes, and they're very much their own standard, or they should be at least, because we could get into language attitudes and linguistic prestige if you would like to. But that means that it's a very widespread language for historic reasons, basically. So that is one side of the story, that the market itself is Anglophone because of history. But what about the modern day? So one issue in the UK at the moment is MFL. Are you familiar with MFL?
No.
So in the UK, in post-primary education, there's some non-compulsory, some optional courses. Up until 2004, MFL, Modern Foreign Languages, was a compulsory course. After 2004, it's become a non-compulsory course, and there are reports showing that it's been in decline, that people don't want to take this course, basically, that people don't want to learn foreign languages. And of course, the question is why? There is a very recent piece of research published in the Journal of the Undergraduate Linguistic Association of the UK, of Britain. So this is a piece of undergraduate research, and my point with that is that it should not be. This topic is something that we should be exploring much further, yes, in much more detail. But I'm very glad to see it as an early career linguist as well. And basically, this researcher tries to tap into the reasons why MFL is unpopular. And they bring forward questions of class, questions of ethnicity, perceived boring curricula, and I'm using the words of people who actually participated in the study, and also the perceived difficulty of the subject. So it's not that people suddenly decided to hate languages. There are tangible reasons for this.
These are students who...
These are pupils in school education. They're not university students who now have the option not to choose a specific course and choose not to take it. And this is, of course, something we should be worried about because this very much has to do with the language deficit that Professor Michael Kelly describes. So this is, in my view, one of the key reasons there of the language crisis, that we are not working on making MFL inclusive, accessible, attractive. Motivation, we know that motivation plays a key role in language learning and language acquisition. Do we motivate our pupils to actually learn foreign languages?
And so apart from motivation, which you've just talked about, what are the other kinds of factors that influence language learning, really?
So there's, again, many factors that influence second language acquisition and learning, and these are kind of two separate things. So motivation would mostly relate to learning than acquisition. There is the age of acquisition, which is, again, very interesting in the context of EAL, because EAL pupils are a very interesting mix of what we call simultaneous and successive bilinguals. Some of them have been exposed to both languages from birth, some a bit later on, and later on in this context can mean 18, 24 months later. So again, very early in life. So that is one factor. Input, how much you're exposed to language. So if you think about first language acquisition and second language acquisition, you basically get roughly half the input in a way, and still you manage to acquire the languages. So that is quite interesting. And then there's other factors that are of a cognitive nature, such as working memory, your cognitive flexibility, or your inhibitory control, that are also quite interesting to explore. But the one I'm actually interested in and I'm researching is prosody.
Okay. So can you tell us a little bit more
Yes.
about prosody then?
As you mentioned at the beginning, prosody can be very roughly characterized as the music of language. The example I like to give is, think of text-to-speech. It sounds robotic. Why does it sound robotic? Because it's kind of flat, there's very unnatural pauses, and essentially it's the prosody that makes it sound so unnatural. So prosody is the rhythm. It has been said that languages have an inherent rhythm, and there's stress time languages, there's syllable time languages, or some languages that can't really be categorized in either of those categories, like Greek. That some people say, oh, it's a mix of both. Others say it's neither of these. So that is quite interesting. There's stress, there's word stress that I'm using right now, otherwise you wouldn't be able to tell what I'm talking about. There is pitch, fundamental frequency, how high or low my voice sounds, basically, to put in very simple terms. There's amplitude, loudness, and there's the pauses. It's the silence that makes the sound stand out in a way when we talk about prosodic prominence. And all of these features taken together can influence language acquisition and processing.
So what role does prosody play in language acquisition?
The right question is what roles, because it actually does quite a lot. We know that 27-week-old fetuses in utero are sensitive to pitch changes before they're even born. We know that prosody can help with understanding word order, so essentially syntax, word segmentation, because if you think about it, when you don't know a language, it is just a stream of sound. You can't really tell words apart. So infants use prosodic cues to segment that stream of endless speech into words that make sense eventually. We know that it helps with the acquisition of the word order in the language that you're exposed to. And I know I just mentioned this, but I'm repeating it because it's very important. There is an overlap between prosody and syntax. It is what I'm particularly interested into. And we know that rhythm plays a key role. Actually, Professor Usha Goswami here at Cambridge, who is also one of the trustees, works very much on rhythm and reading skills. So I'm not going to get into that because she's the expert to talk about this. And what I'm particularly interested in is intonational phrase boundaries. So these are basically those prosodic cues that chunk our speech into units that make sense. They group words together nicely and neatly. They help us avoid ambiguity. They help us chunk our speech into meaningful, nice groups, units. And they are characterized by final syllable lengthening, changes in pitch, pauses. So some prosodic cues come together and create an intonational phrase boundary. And that's what makes speech really comprehensible.
And So then how does this consideration of prosody then help us think about the language crisis differently, or, you know?
I don't have a clear answer to that yet. Ask me in a couple of years when my research will be done. But I have to point out, and because this is coming up a lot, we know that reading prosody, so reading expressively, plays a role in reading comprehension. And we've seen classroom practices that take this into account and try to promote essentially fluency in reading and prosody in reading. That is reading aloud for the most part. That being said, I don't think that is enough by any means, but we need to understand the exact role that prosody plays in order to outline specific classroom practices. And since I don't have an answer to that yet, I can't really suggest anything in particular, but we can come back to that when my PhD is done.
Yes, no, we will. I think then my last question would really be, what do you think sort of meaningful support looks like for pupils for whom English is an additional language? And yeah, what does the teaching look like then?
There is loads of advice for classroom teachers out there, and I'm not trying to replace any of that really, because there are experts who definitely know how to answer this way better than I do. But I think the key point here is differentiated instruction and taking into account that our classrooms are diverse. We are addressing a group of pupils who might have very different needs, and we need to take those needs into account. It might be very hard to quantify those needs, it might be very hard to understand them. But I think assessing the situation is a key point there. But also, even if you do assess the situation, knowing how to address it has to do with teacher training. I believe that inclusivity and diversity in classroom instruction really needs to be part of the teacher training curriculum in higher education. So essentially, I think this is a multi-level issue with a multi-level solution. Sure, it happens in the classroom, but it starts in the university lecture hall, where a teacher will learn how to teach and learn how to address the needs of those pupils who speak English and additional language, because they can be very different from one another. Just because a pupil has the EAL stamp on them, that doesn't tell you much about their actual skills, knowledge, exposure to language, their linguistic background. So I believe we need a very fine-grained, qualitative approach to this.
Thank you very much, Chara, for this fascinating conversation, and we hope you enjoyed this, and please check out our other videos on the website.
Thank you so much for having me. I had so much fun.